Well, thank you very much. I'm a political scientist who studied election law, so the notion that I'm presenting on a panel at a cybersecurity conference already has me a little shaken about my identity. So I think starting without being able to get my PowerPoint up was right on brand. If you voted in the election on Monday, or if you went to the advance polls, you probably had one of the most analog experiences you've had in quite some time. You walk into the polling station where nobody is on their phones, there are no computers available, you hand over your paper card to show who you are. Somebody takes a ruler and a pen and crosses your name off, and then you go into the little booth, and with your little pencil, you mark an X. We don't have many experiences like that in the rest of our lives. So it seems ironic that we're talking about this election in the context of cybersecurity. But in fact, I think there are plenty of things that we need to think about and talk about. Now, I don't need to tell you why it is that political scientists got interested in cybersecurity all of a sudden. In 2016, Canadians obviously pay pretty close attention to American politics. And what we saw in the 2016 presidential election and what's come out subsequently, particularly in the Mueller report, has really indicated that there are, in fact, external cyber threats to domestic elections in the West. And it's not just what happened in the US. There's also evidence from the Ukraine election in 2014, from Brexit, from the 2017 French presidential election, and the list goes on. So it's not surprising that the communications security establishment has, for the last 2 or 3 years, been warning Canadians that we should expect in the 2019 election that there would be some evidence of foreign intervention in the election. And I think before we talk about the public policy responses to this, it's useful to think a little bit about what the threats really are. And what I've tried to do to organize them, this is a little different, but not radically different from the way that the communications security establishment has talked about these threats. When we think about low impact but high probability events, it would include misinformation being distributed digitally, bots and trolls amplifying messages, what's sometimes called computational propaganda, all with the intention of amplifying social tensions. And we certainly saw lots of that in the run-up to the American presidential election. When we think about high impact, and I think I'm not dismissing these, but I'm suggesting that they are lower impact in the sense that it's not absolutely clear that they affect the outcome of the campaign, which is something that we obviously want to pay attention to. Higher impact that might affect the outcome would include things like attacks on the election administration, disruption of the voting process, the notion of a candidate in fact being owned by a foreign power through some kind of manipulation or quid pro quo. But the real concern, and the one that I think increasingly I've come to think is the one that we should be worried about, is the vulnerability of our political parties, the ability of external actors to hack into these, I think, relatively unprotected computer systems, accessing both personal data of voters that are held by the parties and internal documents and correspondence of the parties. So I think that's where there's risks that we really do need to think about that are both high impact and high probability. And when we're thinking about these threats, I think we need to contextualize them in some ways. And certainly I've focused up to this point on the notion of external threat. And that's absolutely what we've seen in the documentation from the communications security establishment and other places. The idea is that hostile actors, foreign actors, might be trying to hack elections. But as we look at what happened in the 2019 election, I think we need to start asking some questions about what is a threat. So if somebody attacks the election administration itself, whether it's foreign or domestic, it's a pretty major event. But when we're talking about things like bots and trolls, it matters whether they're domestic or foreign, whether it's a foreign state or an individual. And I think we need to start thinking very carefully about whether it's one of our allies or a hostile foreign actor. And when I'm talking about our allies, I'm thinking in particular of the United States, and I'll come back to that. So in the run-up to the election, the Canadian policy response at the national level was, I think, pretty robust. There were some significant changes to the Canada Elections Act, which is the one piece of legislation that governs the conduct of elections in Canada. There was legislation that gave the communications security establishment a path to seeking authorization to act in opposition to hostile threats. There were contingency plans within government. This is one of many infographics that were made talking about what would happen in the event of a hostile intervention in the election. And there were measures taken to increase resiliency on the part of voters, asking social media platforms to voluntarily take action when they saw evidence of threats, and working with parties and candidates to at least increase their awareness of concerns. So what sense do we make of what happened? When we think about the threats relating to misinformation, inauthentic communications, and an effort to amplify tensions, we saw a fairly robust set of policies in place. What ended up happening, and this is obviously 2 days after the election, just a first take from what's been covered in the media, what we've heard about what's happened in this space is over 1 million Canadians saw fake content on Facebook from the Buffalo Chronicle, which is a well-known purveyor of fake news out of the United States. There's some evidence of American bots spreading misinformation that sort of started in Canada but then was amplified. And we have one party, the Conservatives, that were advertising on a Chinese media platform that was not compliant. None of this is really the kind of activity that we were cued to expect. There was obviously no disruption of voting, so those measures, I think we can say, were effective, at least in the context of this election. But what remains, and what we did not see evidence of, but the issue that I said I would return to, is the vulnerability of political parties in particular. And here, for people who've studied political parties, there's tremendous continuity. When we talk about election law, there is no neutral outside actor that is establishing election law. This is one of the rare game where the winner of the last round of the game gets to set the rules for the next round of the game. It's the parties themselves that establish these regulations, or at least the party that holds the majority in the House. And there has been a fairly consistent unwillingness on the part of political parties to regulate themselves. They've exempted themselves from privacy legislation, simply putting a measure into the Canada Elections Act saying that every registered political party needs to post its privacy plan, but not with any standards for that. They've been offered assistance, and I don't know of what kind, by the communications security establishment, but there are, again, no requirements for the security of political parties. And I think that's an area of ongoing risk that we need to give some thought to. So if we think about the overall assessment of this, there has been, I think, in comparative terms, a pretty robust response in Canada at the national level. But the framing of the response, that this was a security threat, really did anticipate, I think, in some ways, a quite different set of concerns than what we actually saw in the election, where, to the extent that there was any foreign intervention, it was from the United States, not from the hostile actors that we anticipated. I think we saw that asking platforms to self-regulate will not stop the spread of fake news or misinformation. And one of the real concerns, and I think something that's going to make it even more difficult to move the policy on this forward, is that I think there's an emerging politicization around this. To the extent that there was inauthentic activity, it was in support of one party, the Conservatives, and it was also in support of some minor parties, but one major party. And so I think that there's a narrative that's emerging that suggests that all of these regulations were not legitimate responses to a security concern, but rather a partisan positioning on the part of the governing liberals against the conservatives. And once this has been politicized, as we've seen in the United States, it becomes that much more difficult to regulate. And finally, setting partisanship aside, the common unwillingness of parties to regulate themselves, I think, is an ongoing issue. So I think we will continue to talk about this in the political science community in the years to come.